All right, so let me give you a brief introduction and then I'll hand it over to you. So the first session is titled Playful Pathways and the Power of Learning Through Play for All Ages, and it's going to be delivered by Hannah Simmons. So we're very happy to have her here today. Hannah is a education specialist with over 10 years experience designing, implementing, and evaluating education interventions in the Global South. Her areas of specialty include play-based learning, socio-economic or socio-emotional development, and as well as EdTech. And she's presently the country co-lead for the EdTech Hub in Tanzania. So thank you so much for joining us, Hannah. And we've got about a minute to go, but I think I'll hand it over to you a minute early so you have an extra minute for your session. So Hannah, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Josh, and it's great to be here. I hope that you'll all find this really worthwhile and really informative and engaging as well. Because I know if you're up super early in the morning, you need to have something exciting to switch your brain on as well. So yeah, Josh just introduced me, but I'll also give a bit more background on myself. So as Josh mentioned, I've been working in education for the last 10 years, and much of that has been to do with teacher professional development, and also with supporting the development of content for children and also for parents and caregivers as well. I'm based here in Tanzania. We've had some really awful rains recently. So I'm quite happy to be inside right now. And it's not a bad time of day for me. It's actually just midday here, so it's quite convenient. And in terms of the things that I've been working on, much of it is research into what works in education in different contexts, and also on designing large-scale education programs and implementing those programs with government. And so play has been a big part of my work over the last 10 years. Sometimes it's been about creating playful tools for parents to use at home with children. Sometimes it's been creating fun content for children, such as educational apps or TV and radio shows. And then it's also been about teacher professional development. So bringing play into our teaching and learning environments, which is what I'm here to talk about today. And I saw a question, am I in Dar es Salaam? Yes, I am. So as we get started, or maybe if we could just, before we get started, if I could have the first poll up on the screen. I think Josh, yeah. If I could just ask you all to do this poll, I'm really curious to know which age groups you're most familiar with, because today we're talking about play for all ages, and I want to make sure that I give you some relevant examples and suggestions for adapting playful activities for your different age groups. So yeah, if I could ask you to just do it now, that would be great. Okay. So I can see some of you teach adults, some of you are teaching pre-primary, some of you are teaching kind of youths and young adults. So it's a real mixture actually, which is really interesting. My own experience is with pre-primary through to secondary, but as I said, I've worked a lot with also parents and teachers, so I think they count as adult learners as well. Great. Wow, it's a real variety, I can see. Okay. Well, that brings me then to my first question for you. And you can just put your answers to this in the chat. But I would really like to know, what does play look like for you? So how do you know if your learners are playing? What does play look like when you as an individual play? Or perhaps what does play look like when, for those of you who have children, when your own children play? And I've put this image of a blank piece of paper because I want you to interpret this however you like. So what does play look like for you? And if you could just put your responses in the chat. So fun, forgetting time, smiling, games, cards, colorful. I'm seeing fun come up a lot. Being creative, notion of freedom, being engaged, not taking things seriously, feeling happy, laughter, enthusiasm, teamwork, curiosity. This is really interesting. Great. Okay, having fun. So there's some common themes here, which I think tie into what I'll show you next. So if I go to the next slide. Here we go. So often responses you get to this type of question involve that play is something that is messy, so it can be a bit chaotic. Sometimes, you know, especially with younger children, they are actually making a mess, whether that is with colors, whether it's with clay or sand. But messy also suggests that it's a bit disorganized, and it's dynamic. And then sociable, I think quite a few of you have mentioned that. So play can be socializing with family, with friends, doing something together like teamwork. And I think some of you also mentioned smiling and laughter. And we can see that in this image here that the boy is laughing. So it's a kind of joyful socializing. And then quite a few of you have also mentioned creativity. And so we also see that a lot when we think of play is creating things, being innovative and expressing yourself through different mediums. So I'll move to the next slide now. So what does play feel like to you? So if you think about either yourself as an individual or about someone you teach, how do you think they feel when they're playing? And again, you can just put your responses to this in the chat. Yes, happy, interested, excited, light mood, relaxed, good, joyful. There's a lot of positive descriptions coming out here. So excited, engaged, enthusiastic. What I'm not seeing is anything about certainly being bored or disinterested or unhappy. There's a lot of joyful excitement, satisfaction. That's really great to see. So if I go to the next slide, I think this ties into what a lot of you have said here. So often when we ask people, what does play feel like? They'll say it feels fun. There's that element of joy, of happiness in there. And many of you also said relaxing. So play is a time when we feel at ease. We're not stressed. We're not worried about things. And play can also feel silly. I think this comes back to the idea of enjoyment. It's not a serious activity. It's not boring. And it's a time when we can express ourselves in whichever weird and wonderful way we would like to. But what I think a lot of you have not touched on here, and this is really common when we think about play and learning, is we don't think of play as being like a focused activity. We don't think of play as being especially meaningful or productive. And because of that, often when it comes to learning, we don't think of play as being part of learning. We think of play as being a break from learning. So, we read our books and then we go to play to relax and unwind and enjoy after all that reading. And so what I hope today will do is to really shed some light on how play can be a vehicle for learning itself and not just a break from learning. So in today's session, we'll look first at what do we mean by learning through play. I'll then take you through what I call building blocks of learning through play. And I'll explain when I get to that about why I'm using this term building blocks and how that can be really useful in how we conceptualize and understand play. Then I'll touch briefly on what the evidence around learning through play says. As a researcher myself, I'm really enthusiastic about there being strong evidence to support the things we do in education. Because that's how we do right by our learners. And then I'll take a look specifically at learning through play for English language development and strategies for the English language classroom, because I know that that's really what has brought you all here today. And as we go through this, I'll also try to make time for your questions. So I think many of you are posting questions on the Q&A chat on that tab. And I think the moderator, Josh, will help me to just identify some of those questions to respond to. So I'll try and do that a little bit throughout the session. And I'll also leave space at the end for your questions as well. So let's dive into it. So what is learning through play? So learning through play can also be understood by other names. And like many things in education, we have a lot of different words for essentially the same thing. So learning through play is also known as play-based pedagogy or playful learning or play-based learning. But essentially it's where play is a key part of the learning experience. And so when we think of play as a learning opportunity, there's two ways in which it presents itself as an opportunity. So the first way is what we call spontaneous learning. So spontaneous learning is when something happens out of the blue that we didn't plan for. So it can be incidental, and because it's unplanned, it's most of the time very personal. So the person who is learning, the learner themselves, happens to do something, and it gives them new information that they can now hold on to and helps them understand something new. So a really good example of spontaneous learning in younger children is, for example, when they're painting. And as they're painting, you often see that children will naturally mix their paints together and create new colors. And so a child who mixes blue and yellow together and incidentally makes green will discover that blue and yellow mixed together make green, but not because we told the child, oh, you need to mix this color and this color, but because they were doing an activity that was fun and engaging for them, and they happened to learn something through that activity. Intentional learning, on the other hand, is where we have a particular learning objective in mind, and we design activities to help our learners reach that conclusion. So again, if we're thinking of colors and perhaps we're teaching children colors in English, or learners, let me say, we could have everybody standing and we say, find someone who is wearing blue. And all of those who go to someone wearing blue will stay standing. Anyone who goes to someone who is not wearing blue now has to sit down. And then we say, okay, now go to someone who is wearing some green. Everyone who goes to someone wearing green would stay standing. Everybody who doesn't go to someone wearing green would sit down. And when you do these kinds of activities, even if they didn't originally know the words blue and green, they would be learning that through a process of deduction, by seeing, okay, so I got a point here, I didn't get a point here. Okay, that's because blue equals this color and green equals this color. So that's more intentional learning as opposed to spontaneous. So when we talk about learning through play, it's also important to understand the different types of play. So what I just mentioned was different types of learning opportunity, and now these are different types of play. So free play is what we most commonly think of when we think of play. We think of unstructured activities, so learners doing whatever they feel like doing. There's no structure, there are no rules, they're expressing themselves and they're creating and they're doing what they feel like. Free play is also open-ended. So open-ended means there's no particular goal in mind. That play can go in whichever direction the learner wants it to. So for example, if we go to the beach, people play with sand in different ways. Some people want to dig a hole. Some people want to build a sand castle. Some people want to make a sculpture out of sand. Some people just want to feel the sand running through their fingers. So there's no particular goal to being at the beach and how you play with sand. Free play is also learner-driven, so it tends to be something that the learner themselves is interested in or curious about. So, you know, if I gave all of you a piece of clay, I'm sure you would do totally different things with it, because you'll do something that is interesting or inspiring or motivating to you, not necessarily what is motivating to the person next to you or to your teacher or to your parent, etc. And therefore, free play is associated with creativity, with exploration, and with iteration, by which I mean where we tweak something either to make it better or to make it work, or just because we want to see what happens when we adjust something. So in opposition to free play is guided play. So guided play is either structured or semi-structured. So structured play could be something like a board game where there are specific rules which you need to follow. And semi-structured could be something like saying to your class, everybody is going to do a role play on a hospital visit. Now there's some structure there because it's a role play and we've got a topic, hospital visit, but those who are making the role play can take that in whichever direction they like. They could do a hospital visit because someone is giving birth. They could be a hospital visit because someone has broken their leg. So there's only a bit of structure there. It's not kind of dictated to them how the play has to go. So guided play is typically scaffolded by the teacher. So the teacher might ask questions or provide prompts or tips to help the learners stay on the right path to learning the target objective. So for example, if the target objective is, let's say, future tense, so we want them to use the vocabulary that they know, but in the future, let's say that they are going to be talking about an event that is happening the next day and they're doing a news report as a role play. Then the teacher might come and help them to think about, well, did you just say that verb in the future tense though? What would the future tense of that one be? And to kind of help them along the way in their preparation. So I think that brings us now to the building blocks of learning through play. And after these building blocks, I'll just check if there are any questions coming to me. So the building blocks of learning through play, I think, are a really helpful tool for teachers when it comes to designing play-based learning activities for your classroom. So there are 5 building blocks to learning through play. And these are what the Lego Foundation, so those who create Lego, the Lego Foundation uses in their play-based learning pedagogical tools as well. So the first one is that play is meaningful. So what we mean by that is that it relates to our world. So it's something that feels connected to the learner. Play is also engaging. So a lot of you mentioned this in the chat, but playful learning should be engaging in the sense of both our minds are thinking about the activity, but it's also a hands-on experience. So rather than simply writing a story, a role play is a much more hands-on, engaging experience of interacting with a story. Play-based learning, as many of you mentioned, is socially interactive. So it brings us together either to work as a team or to be in competition with each other, or simply to just share ideas and communicate as we engage in activities. Learning through play is also about iteration. So iteration means that we can try something, we can fail, that idea didn't work, and then we try it again. And there's a notion of taking a bit of learning from what didn't work and incorporating it into our next attempt or our next piece of work. And I think the thing that you've all really emphasized in the chat is that play is joyful. So therefore, learning through play should also be about having fun. So there's 2 key things to note about building blocks of learning through play. So the first is that if you think about these 5 different words, they're quite subjective. So what feels meaningful to me as Hannah will be things that relate to my world. What feels meaningful to Josh, for example, I think in Japan, will be things that relate to his world. Now, I've never been to Japan. So if you bring something about Japan into my lesson, that's new information. So that's about how does Hannah understand a new world that she's never visited. But if you want to relate it to my world, you should be thinking about where I'm from, what tools I bring to the classroom, what knowledge I have, what skills I have, and what experiences I have as well. And so therefore, when we're working with, for example, English language learners, we should also be trying to get to know our learners, figuring out what are their experiences, what are their cultures, so that we can really try and connect what we're teaching them with things that relate to their wider world and also to their daily life as well, so they can actually make use of it. Also, things like joyful. We want our learners to have fun while they're learning, but what feels like fun is going to be different to many of us. So I think for anyone who has children or who works with very young children, you might know that you can play peekaboo with children endlessly, baby children, where you hide your face and you surprise them. And they can laugh at that again and again for hours. But with adults, that's not fun for them. That's quite boring and predictable. So we also need to try and pitch our learning through play lessons at the right level so that they are engaging, fun and meaningful for those of who we are actually teaching. The other thing I wanted to mention, on building blocks of play is that when we think of them as blocks, it allows us to say you can manipulate them, you can move them around. So although there are 5 here on the screen, not every play-based learning lesson has to have all 5. You can have really good playful activities, which are just 2 or 3 of these. So it's important to think of these as kind of a toolbox and say, which of these blocks do I want to put in this lesson? Or here's my activity. How could I incorporate some of these blocks into my activity to make it more playful? So to give you an example of that, here I've given an activity which is meaningful, engaging, and joyful, but not really iterative and not really socially interactive. So if you ask learners, draw your dream house and label as many items in it as you can, this gives them a chance to think about, what would I want in a dream house? So it's meaningful to them. What's if I were building a house, is it a palace? Is it a tree house? Is it the house that I grew up in? It's engaging because it's hands-on. They're doing this themselves. They're not just reading about it or watching it on a screen. And it can also be joyful because it's about dreaming. It's about thinking of all the things you could achieve. If you had all the money in the world, what would you put in your house? And then it relates back to their building of vocabulary because they're getting to label these things. So here they might come across words that they don't know in English, and then the teacher might help them with those words as part of that guided play and providing that scaffolding. So in contrast to that, you could have a game of Guess Who I Am. So here, I'm not sure how big it will be on your screen. On my screen, it's quite small, but these are my godchildren actually here in Tanzania. So the girl has a post-it note, a sticky note that says elephant, and and the boy is pointing at it. So with this game, you could give all of your learners a post-it note. They could write down, for example, an animal, and then they have to stick that on their partner's head. And now their partner has to go around the room asking questions to try and figure out which is the animal they have on their head. So they could say, do I have 4 legs? Do I have a tail? Do I live in water, for example? And this allows them to kind of practice vocabulary, practice their communication. But it's also a bit silly, a bit fun. It's engaging because, you know, they're having to use their minds, but they might also be moving around the classroom, asking questions. It's iterative because every time they get a question wrong, they have to think, okay, so I only have, you know, maybe I don't have any legs. So I know I got that question wrong. So, you know, could I be a snake perhaps? It's joyful because they're getting to think of which animal do they want to give to their partner, which one would be hard to guess, or which one is a new one that they've learned in English. And it's socially interactive because they're communicating with one another. So I'll just quickly, before I go to what the evidence says, I'll just quickly check the questions. So let me have a look at some of these. How is online play different from offline play? So that's a really good question. I would say that, you know, there can be different types of online play and offline play. Online play where you are creating something, let's say even when you open the Paint app on your computer and you're just drawing a picture, you're creating things, you're adding effects, that's open-ended and that could be free play. It's just the medium that you're using is digital. But equally, you could be playing a video game where that's much more guided, structured play because you have a specific goal in mind that you need to reach the end of a level, or you need to rescue someone, and you have certain structured activities that you need to complete to achieve that goal. I think there are a lot of different language-based learning activities that you can do online, which are still playful. If you think about different games that you have where maybe you need to click through the different words and then remember the word which matches a particular picture. Like, as long as that feels fun, if that relates to the world that you live in, so it's meaningful, and if it's engaging and you feel focused doing that activity, that's still a playful experience. Play doesn't have to be offline to count as play. So I think hopefully those building blocks will help to help you as a teacher to decide whether or not something does constitute play with your learners. I'll try and get through some of these other ones. So when is the time that learning through play isn't suitable or is a bad idea? Oh, sorry, I'm getting some pop-ups. I would say that learning through play is a really effective way to introduce a new idea, because it makes this idea seem fun and welcoming, and people feel comfortable then with the idea of learning. It's a really good way to revise because it stops something being boring and repetitive. So if there's vocabulary that you taught last week, why not use a playful activity to revisit that vocabulary? And I'll come towards the end for some of the specific benefits that play brings to language learners especially. But play, I would say, can be unhelpful when you are trying to prepare people for a particular test or exam. I would say there's still an important role that play will serve in that situation, which is getting them to know the language, getting them to feel confident, getting them engaged so they actually want to learn. But you'll still have to do some of the kind of repetitive structured activities which might be in that test. So whether that's like just doing mock exams, for example, sometimes that's really necessary in order that our learners go into the exam well prepared. I'll just take one more question. How can we use games with an adult audience without it being perceived as useless? That's a really interesting question. And I want to touch on that because a lot of the work that I've done with parents, particularly in East Africa, there's a lot of stigma around play. So because we think of it as being silly, we think, oh, I don't want to do that because I'm going to look stupid and I can't possibly learn something here. So I think one of the key things is not telling them that it's play, just giving them an activity, telling them that you want to try something that's fun and that they can be as creative as they like with it. And then getting them to reflect on how did that feel for you, and then communicating, yeah, that's because you were playing. That's just how it is to play as an adult. So for me, you know, some of the ways that I play are through like conversation. You know, a really good one could be saying, okay, everyone's going to come up with a surprising fact about themselves. As the teacher, I'll help you write this fact out in English. And then you have to guess which fact belongs to which other person in the classroom. And that can really stimulate discussion. It makes you think about one another from a different angle. You know, as adults, it gives them control over what they want to share or what thing about themselves that they would like it if others knew. And it's also not so silly. They don't have to feel vulnerable because they can choose which fact they share about themselves. So I think my main message with adults would be to emphasize that you want to do something that is fun. Give them some agency. Don't make it too structured. And then reflect back and think about how did that feel, and then tell them, yeah, that was play. You know, play isn't just for little children. So I'll move back now to the slide. So what does the evidence say? So learning through play supports learners' holistic development. So, and this is not just true of young children, although I think arguably you could say development of like numeracy, skills or early language would be more appropriate for young children. But play helps us develop in all sorts of ways. So in terms of our cognitive development, it helps us develop language. It helps us develop number sense and understanding how quantities relate to each other. It helps us develop problem-solving skills. In terms of our physical development, it helps develop, for example, motor skills like jumping, balancing, hand-eye coordination, even fine motor skills like holding a pencil. It helps us develop our socio-emotional skills, which are important for all our relationships, not just for our classroom relationships. So those include, for example, empathy or conflict resolution, so resolving arguments between people, and even just our communication in general, which is a really key part of English language development. So these are just some examples of evidence, but there is a rich body of evidence to support learning through play. And I'll be happy to provide some of those to you, perhaps when they send out the recording, if you're interested. But there was a study by Fisher and colleagues, which was about teaching children shapes. And they found that if you learn shapes through play, it was more effective than traditional teaching. And that was to do with introducing characters. So this character only likes real shapes. So can you help me find the ones that are real shapes among this array of shapes? So it wasn't necessarily that the shape couldn't be a shape. It was about how we describe shapes and what reason we give learners for trying to find shapes. And similarly, McInnes and colleagues found that playful puzzle solving led to increased focus and actual better problem solving in other scenarios. So instead of it being like, you need to solve this, making the puzzle a playful experience where they were enjoying themselves, they were engaged, and they had a real reason for wanting to solve the problem, meant that it was easier for them to apply those skills elsewhere. And this is why we want to do play-based learning with English language, in order that learning English in a playful way means that you'll be better able to apply it in other scenarios. So how can learning through play support English language development? And I hope that this will feel relevant to many of you. So firstly, play promotes social interaction and communication. So when we have a playful activity in the classroom, learners are encouraged to support one another. That's how we create a joyful environment, is we have a friendly environment. Learners are also encouraged to interact with one another and with their teacher. So this is really important because games might involve verbal communication or other types of communication or teamwork, as we mentioned. But when we do playful learning, we also think about the learners being able to engage with their teacher in a way that stops the teacher feeling like someone that they can't ask questions to, or someone who's kind of too superior or too much of an authority figure to approach. So it kind of brings everyone together by creating that friendly atmosphere. And it also, which is really important for English language, it also helps to apply language in context. So for example, when we think of role plays, we're asking learners to use language that they know in an actual context that fits that vocabulary. And so therefore it helps them to practice, whether that is grammar, whether that's vocabulary, in a context that is meaningful and relevant, as opposed to just writing out sentences and changing the tense of those sentences, for example. We want them to actually use their tenses in real life conversation. Play also creates a safe environment for failure. So we mentioned this notion of iteration, which is one of the building blocks of play. But by having that, we create an environment which in which learners feel comfortable to not get things right first time. So iterative activities, by virtue of being iterative, involve repetition. because you're going back, you're tweaking something, you're doing the same thing again to try and improve it. And so therefore there's a notion of going back and repeating that task again. So that creates an opportunity to go back and get things right, which you may not have gotten right the first time. So for example, if it is vocabulary, it could be that you don't get that vocabulary right the first time, but because we're iterating, we're practicing that task again, you can try again the next time and you might get it right then, or you might get more of that sentence correct or more of that grammar accurate. Failure in play is also seen as an opportunity to learn and improve. And that's really important because it shifts our mindset as we're learning. It makes us feel like failure isn't a reflection on our ability as a person or our value as a person. It helps us to see it as something where, oh, okay, I'll try again next time. Next time, maybe I'll improve on this thing. And that's really important across the board, but particularly in language, because often we can have learners who on paper are very good, but really don't have the confidence to apply their language in actual communication contexts. And so knowing that it's okay to fail helps them to think, okay, I'm just going to do my best. It's okay if I don't get the grammar right. I'm still going to try and communicate as best I can. And so that's really, really important for all language learners. So another way in which it supports English language development is by making the content meaningful. Again, meaningfulness was one of the building blocks. So it connects the learning to the learner's actual lives. So as I mentioned with, or if, let's say we took an example of asking learners to act out their parents' job, for example. That's very personal to them because it allows them to bring their home life, something that they know about, something that they're an expert on in the classroom. Nobody else in the classroom knows their parents the way they do. It allows them to come and bring that to the learning environment. And therefore that can be empowering because it's meaningful to them as well. Making content meaningful also gives learners choices. So as we said, what feels meaningful to you might not feel meaningful to me. And therefore, a meaningful activity should have an element of choice where I get to say, oh, this is what I would like to do because I'm interested in this, or this is the color or the prop or the adjective which speaks to me most. And that could be, for example, choose 3 adjectives to describe yourself. That's meaningful and it's personal and it's a choice. It also allows learners to explore their interests and to express themselves. So rather than having to always engage with content that's given to them in a textbook, it allows them to say, what do I want to bring to this lesson? Who am I? And part of that can also be helping them to understand other parts of themselves which aren't necessarily to do with their English language. It could even be, asking them every day to choose a word which describes their spirit or how they're feeling that day. And that gives them a chance to also reflect, how am I feeling today? Am I feeling good? Am I feeling bad? Am I feeling nervous? Am I feeling excited? And so that's not just an opportunity for them to explore and expand their vocabulary, but also a chance for them to think about and check in with themselves as well. Learning through play encourages learning to be joyful. I think we all touched on this, and it's probably the most poignant thing about learning through play. So learners will enjoy learning when learning is joyful. And I mentioned this before, but I'll just emphasize that building a positive relationship with language is critical to learning. And so when we can make learning fun and positive and a warm, friendly experience, it means we create that same relationship with the language. And I think, for example, I live in East Africa, I speak Swahili, and I studied Swahili at university. And I thought that I would study French or German, because those were the languages we did in school. And I've had the best experience learning Swahili because people love it when you say even just 2 words in Swahili, they love it. And when I compare that to some of my friends who perhaps studied French, the barrier to being praised by French people for learning French was much higher. You have to be much better at French before people will tell you you've done a great job. And that's not a dig at our French colleagues. I think that French is a wonderful language, and I wish I was better. But I can certainly say that for me, it made the language learning experience really great learning Swahili, because I was constantly being told, oh, that's so wonderful, you said this word, oh, you greeted me, that's so exciting. It makes you want to try harder. And that in turn inspires and it motivates learners as well. Just waiting for the next slide to be. It also enhances learner well-being. So, when we learn through play, learners are at ease, they're open to the learning experience, they're also bonding with others, and they also are adopting a positive mindset, which can carry over into many other aspects of their life. So not just about their ability to learn English, but also about their ability to actually learn anything. So, sometimes I'm sure all of us who have had to learn another language, seeing yourself achieve that, and, many of you here today, I think, have learned English as a second language. Knowing that you've achieved that makes you think, what else can I achieve? What else could I learn? I'm just waiting for the next class. Okay. So now I'll just go through some of the challenges of learning through play in the English language classroom. And I'm sure some of these will speak to questions that you might have had as well. So often in an English language classroom, we'll have mixed abilities. And that can be really tricky because one activity might not suit everyone. So I know that's definitely a challenge that we might face. In that case, it can be good to think about what are activities where stronger English language speakers could support their peers. So how could you either group by abilities, or could you make sure that you divide your stronger English language learners among the groups so that they're evenly spread and they can support their peers? It can also be seen as a type of learning that's quite resource heavy. So when we think of paints, of clay, of role play props, of pens and pencils, that's quite a lot of resources. And I know working here in East Africa, most teachers don't have those. So I think we should see that as a challenge of how can I get creative with what I have? Is it about imagining something as a prop? Is it about saying, okay, I'm going to use this cloth and pretend it's a hat, because in this role play, I want my character to wear a hat. Is it about creating resources that you can use in your classroom as well? And then finally, I think it can be challenging to focus on specific English language skills. So naturally, there are going to be some things that lend themselves better to play-based learning. So for example, nouns which are abstract can be quite difficult to fit into play-based learning because they're abstract, we can't see them. That's very different from teaching colors, where it's something that we can map onto an actual image as well. So I would encourage you to think about which learning objectives lend themselves to play. And it doesn't mean that everything has to be play-based learning, but it's about integrating elements of play-based learning into your lessons. Okay, so now I'll just wrap up with some strategies for using learning through play, and then I can jump over to your questions as well. So, what are some of the strategies that you can use for learning through play in an English language classroom? So first, I would say plan. I know you need to plan your lessons anyway, but plan for lessons to include play in them. If you plan ahead, then that gives you time to think about resources, to think about the time you need for a playful activity, to think about how you want to engage the different students that you have, whether you need to put them in groups, whether you're going to have a whole class activity. So planning is really important. I would say use play to target your learning goals. So if you think back to when I said free play is unstructured, it's open-ended, and when you do free play, the learning is spontaneous. It just happens that they'll learn something, but you cannot control what the learner will learn. So when you use learning through play, think about what you want them to learn and try and find activities that are either structured or semi-structured that allow you to guide your learners towards that learning goal. So again, if it were, for example, getting them to practice the past tense, then you might say, I want you to create a newspaper, and all your stories in the newspaper need to be in the past tense. So you can do whatever stories you like. They could be from another planet, they could be from your home, you could do it in pairs, you could do it individually, but it's about past tense. So there's a lot of creativity there, but it also allows you to make sure that your learners are moving towards the objective that you have. Use the building blocks approach. Think about things that you have planned and ask yourself, could I make this one more iterative? Could I create opportunities in this one for there to be trial and error? And that could be even, for example, a game or a song like, actually, let me come back to the game. So a game like Simon Says, where maybe you have to do a certain action, but only if I say Simon Says. So Simon says, touch your head, you would do this. If I don't say Simon Says and I just say touch your head, you shouldn't do it. So that's about your executive functioning, whether you're following instructions, but also it's about your understanding of the language of the specific tasks that I've told you to do. And so that gives you a chance to try and fail, but there's no issue if you fail. You might lose the game, but it's not about a failure of a task or a failed exam, for example. And you could think about, how do you make that more socially interactive? You could let one of your students run that game instead. You could split them into groups. You could, for example, if you have a song, also body parts like heads, shoulders, knees, and toes, ask them to change the lyrics of the song to other body parts. And then they can make it up however they want. So, you know, there's opportunities there for something to be adapted and to become more playful. And finally, create a friendly and supportive environment. So try and make sure that your learners feel comfortable, that you encourage them, that they encourage and support one another, so that they want to learn and that they want to come back and develop that positive relationship with English. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I just want to direct your attention to Toy Team, which is a new pre-primary course brought to you by OUP. And this is specifically for early learners. But if you use this QR code, you can register now for the waitlist, and it will be launching in autumn. So that's a really exciting new library of content, and I hope you'll enjoy that as well. But thank you so much for listening. And I'll now just go over to the Q&A. So hopefully be able to answer some of your questions there. Okay, let's see. So, okay, there was one. Let me scroll up. So if a student makes mistakes, won't it lead to anxiety? So a really good way to stop students feeling anxious if they make mistakes is to show that you as a teacher can also make mistakes. So you could do this, for example, with that Simon Says game. Let one of your students do it and you play along, and let yourself be one of the ones that gets out of the game early. And that just shows that you have that resilience, that you don't think that failing is a big problem. And so that can help inspire other students to see it in the same way. I think it's also really important to acknowledge things that students do well, so that the mistakes are like, oh, not to worry, you said this one wrong, just say it this way and we'll move on. It doesn't have to be something we fixate on, because anxiety is often lead to like connected with a fixation on a particular issue. There's a question here on how to prevent children shifting to their native language while playing. So there's a lot of schools of thought around the role of native language. Personally, I think that depending on the age, we really want children to develop a positive relationship with English. So if we're punishing them or we're making them feel bad for using their native language, they're just going to create anxiety about not knowing the word in English. So you could do that, for example, by creating a mechanism where they can come to you as the teacher with words that they don't know. You could make it that they, for individual students, that their goals are a little bit different. So it could be that their goal is to use 5 new words in the activity. So let's say, for example, that we were doing the dream house activity. It could be that you want them to learn 5 new words. Another student, it might be that you want to see how much they know because they have a lot of English language. So in that case, I would say, ask that student to come to you if they don't know the word, or ask the student, pair the student with another child who does know those words, and they can work together. When I work with children, I usually ask them to try to say it in English. If they don't know, I'll say, okay, can you tell me in Swahili, and I'll help you say it in English. And then we say it a few times together, and then we just keep playing. So it stops the disruption in the play, but it also stops it feeling like a really negative thing that they've gone back to their mother tongue. Is play-based learning the same of task-based learning? Not necessarily, because play-based learning could be a particular task where it would be guided play, so it's more structured or semi-structured, but it can also be free play, and it could be that kind of spontaneous learning. So, you know, we just gave learners a bunch of resources and we told them do whatever you want. And in that case, they'll learn things, but it might not be particular objectives that we've set out. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? Can online sources like mobile games be helpful? Yep, they absolutely can. I think the quality of the game is quite important. So it's important not to say that any English language game, mobile game or app is inherently good or useful. Because, for example, so one thing I see a lot in East Africa is that language learning apps which are made for, let's say, UK or European learners might not relate to the African English language learner, because all the examples they give are so different. So, you know, think about the context and think about why you're using the app. Is it just to build particular vocabulary? Is it something that they could do from home when they're not in class? So think about why your why for using it, and try to make sure it meets that why. And I'll just do one more. So how can I use Play with CV writing skills in my adult class? Oh, that's a really interesting one. So it depends what their like level of English is, but I imagine if they're doing CV writing, it's probably quite strong. You could do things like where they need to, let's say you could ask them to come up with their own company, and they need to figure out all the jobs that they need for that company. And they're going to create like job descriptions for all those different jobs. So that's like creative. They can choose the company. It gets them to think about using job associated vocabulary, and also think about what are the skills and things that an employer wants from an employee. And they could also do something creative. They could make that on Canva. It could be like a really beautiful thing where they come and present it. You could make it into a bit of a pitch thing where I'm not sure if you're familiar with the TV show Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, but it could be something like that, where you have them come and pitch themselves to a board of judges. And that's like a verbal CV where they've got maybe 3 minutes. It's your elevator pitch. Tell me about yourself, just to kind of get them comfortable with what the purpose of a CV is and using some of that vocabulary. I think that's my time up now. So I'd just like to say thank you again so much for your time, your attention, your questions. It's been great speaking with you all, and yeah, best of luck with bringing Play to your learners.